Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, Energy versus Climate partnered with Solar Alberta to produce a live in-conference podcast at the 2021 Solar Show. Tune in to hear our thoughts on the role of PV generation in Alberta and what its growth could mean for the electricity grid, jobs, and Canada's climate targets. In particular, David and I debated the pros and cons of Alberta producing its own solar power versus importing power from jurisdictions like Arizona, with David arguing hard for the latter. As you'll hear, given that it was at a Solar Alberta conference, David once again showed his fearless ability to walk into a room, even a virtual one, and tell people exactly what they don't want to hear. Now on to the show. Thanks so much, and hello and welcome everyone to episode 3 of season 2 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, as Heather said, and I'm joined, of course, by Sarah and David, my usual webinar co-hosts. We're very happy to be doing our first in-conference ever recording of the 2021 Solar Show. So this is new for all of us. Listen, Heather's covered all the housekeeping. We want to leave lots of time for Q&A. So let's just dive right into the topics. And our first question we're going to tackle, we're going to look into the future. We're going to look into our crystal ball. So Sarah, I'm going to turn to you. It's 2030. Sarah, you're on the cusp of your 50s. You're just starting to get a few gray hairs. Your twin boys are now fine young men. You look out the window of your Tesla hover car, and as you fly around the province or hover around the province, tell us what you see in 2030 with regards to solar development.
Well, you paint it's a stark picture there, Ed, as far as my life. But as far as the solar goes, I see a lot more solar than we have today. I think I see a mix of solar that is both utility scale and also a fair amount of distributed solar on rooftops. I see a lot more energy demand in the province in the summertime. Our summers are, despite our best efforts, still getting somewhat hotter, hopefully only somewhat, and people are installing air conditioners. And so we have solar that's generating on those days when we need it most. And it's working as part of a grid with many different elements to it. So solar and wind and storage and transmission and demand response and energy efficiency. And solar is really in there playing a role.
Great. Okay. Thanks. David, same question. It's 2030. You've now long retired from academia, from solar geoengineering, from carbon engineering. You're in your 60s and you're starting your career as a rookie professional climber and reporter for Rock and Ice. You're touring Alberta, looking for climbs and stories. What do you see with regards to solar development?
I'm not going to say what I think will happen. I'll say something kind of radical about what I'd like to see happen. So I'd like to see, I don't want to see such a big mixture of things because there's really a limited number of ways to decarbonize that make sense, and solar is one of them. I'd like to see a massive amount of solar power flowing into Alberta, many gigawatts, but I'd like to see most of that power not in Alberta. Alberta has a lousy solar resource compared to places to the south. That's just the geophysical reality. So I'd like to see multiple, hundreds of megawatts to gigawatt scale installations in Arizona or thereabouts with a high voltage DC line bringing power up to Alberta. There's nothing radical about that. Line will only be half as long. It's the longest lines in the world. And the cost of delivering that power would be much less than if we built it in Alberta at scale. I don't want to fool around with a climate problem. I want to solve it. And solve it means getting away from little tiny things, getting away from the city of Edmonton subsidizing 40 cents $0.4 a watt for solar installation on people's roofs. That's green bling. I want to use the money to solve the problem, and I want to see much stronger interties to British Columbia to use their dams to manage our variability. That's a pathway to actually getting to zero fast with the technologies we have.
Well, David, I really think you've just fired the starter's pistol on the Q&A today with talking about bringing in solar from Arizona and solar in Alberta having a lousy solar resource. So, as you would have heard Heather say, do start putting in your questions. You don't have to wait till hour to put them in. What I see is I think I'm bullish, but I don't think I'm Pollyannish on solar. And I say right off the top, I don't think solar and wind is going to address or are going to address Alberta's energy needs. They're obviously part of a larger energy mix. But at the risk of stacking the upcoming poll vote, I think by 2030, we're going to have a couple gigawatts of solar operating in Alberta. I think we're going to continue the trend on mega projects in southern Alberta with Traverse, with Claresholm, with Strathmore. And I think we're going to be seeing those projects integrating grid stabilization and storage solutions. And if yesterday's webinar that I attended that the federal government offered is any indicator, we're going to have a lot of federal investment in that. I also see, I think we're going to have increased openness amongst rural communities to renewables playing a major role, including now a larger role in offsetting the tax-based losses coming from a decline in oil and gas activity. And I think we're going to see greater Indigenous participation in renewable projects writ large. And some of that is going to be driven by the corporate PPA market. We haven't touched really around distributed solar. We'll get into it, but I see a doubling or tripling of distributed solar, continuing the trend that we had from 2015 to 2019 when we went from 2 to 80 megawatts. On interties, David, I agree with you in theory. I think because of fiefdoms, because of interprovincial politics, because of a lack of federal leadership, because it's a no-win file for a bunch of people, I think interties are going to remain severely limited between the provinces. And therefore, I think we need to look within our own borders for our own production needs. Those are our opening statements, folks. We're going to go on to another question. I think you're going to hear back and forth between the three of us and get your questions in. Let's launch the first poll and gets this question, how much solar will be on the grid by 2030? And as that poll is launched, I want to ask David, what kind of role can solar play as a generator in the Alberta electricity grid? How big should it be? Maybe expand upon what you've just said in your opening remarks.
I'm really focused on decarbonization for climate. That's the thing that motivates me the most. And it's not my job to say, analyze the way governments do crony capitalism now. It's my job to advocate for what I think makes sense. So you may be right that everything will stay inside one border, but I think at some point you'll see a yellow vest-like tax revolt. The reality is if we actually want to decarbonize at the scale that we need to, doing it all within borders might more than double or triple costs. It just doesn't make sense. In the end, if we're spending public money to solve a problem like climate change, it is our duty, as it is the duty of publicly elected officials and the duty of advisors like us to clearly explain the cost trade-offs. So the reality is if you do this all the way you're talking about, which I agree is the way it's going, you get half as much or less carbon reduction per unit money spent. And that's public money that could go to do other things, could protect poor children, could protect parents. So you're wasting that money. So when I look at the unit that say Edmonton, that I'm sure in a well-intentioned way is paying this 40 cents a watt for people solar on people's roofs, that's for very low generation factors and high capex, 40 cents a watt buys a complete system at the gigawatt scale in southern down south that will produce 30% capacity factors before DC. I'm interested in solving problems. We need to drive emissions to zero. We need to do it in a couple decades. And the solar industry has done a great job getting started. Now we got to get serious. And getting serious means not screwing around with putting on people's roofs unless that's something they want to pay for with their own money because they have something they like about it.
Sure. And maybe I'll jump in here. So as we have this conversation around nuclear. So I agree with you in principle, but you're also suggesting that humans are rational economic actors. And based on the amount of rooftop solar that we have going up, including full disclosure, I've got rooftop solar systems on 2 roofs. a 3.7 kilowatt system and a 4 kilowatt system. My payback is still decades, but I felt it a good use of my disposable income to invest in that. And Albertans don't like gigantic power lines. We fought an election in 2013. The PC party of Alberta at the time nearly lost the election because they tried to push gigantic power lines down the throats of Alberta voters. And that was the Yellow Vest revolt at the time, is people pushing back on those power lines. But Sarah, sorry, let's get you in here.
Thanks, Ed. So I like how David started, because I mean, I'm also interested in solving problems. And I think that to me, the question is not, should we build more solar in Alberta, or should we build out transmission lines? I think we should be doing both, right? And so, sure, if I could sit down with a map of North America and say, I'm going to design, the power system of the future, and I have a couple days to do that with a smart modeler, and then I get to hand it over to someone and make it so, a certain model of the grid would emerge. But we know that we're not going to be able to start building that today. I think we should, and I have also advocated for, real work to build out our transmission lines. But I also think that there is room for a significant amount of solar expansion in the interim as well. So I think it's sort of not a matter of, is the one better than the other, but we build out a reasonable amount of solar within the province as we're building out the rest. And then similarly on the rooftop, I don't disagree that the approach that's being taken today to kind of really, nurture and start the rooftop solar industry in Alberta is one that is, kind of a broad strokes approach. Ideally, again, what we would do is do that really detailed distribution level modeling and understand where we can put solar on rooftops that actually saves money, because we can do that. But, in the absence of that, spending a bit of money to get this going, I think, is not a bad use of funds. Also for the other things that it brings in terms of both jobs, but actually also really allowing people to have a different relationship with energy and think about energy in a different way, which is hard to quantify.
Sure. Yeah, no,
I really think it is our duty as analysts to talk seriously about trade-offs. There is a limited amount of money. Alberta is going to have a lot of challenges as the oil industry goes down, very serious challenges. There are very poor people living on a reserve not far from me, and poor families in Calgary. So if we are going to say seriously that it's okay to take public money to pay rich people, subsidize them to put solar on rooftops when it doesn't make environmental sense, we got to ask why we're saying that.
Well, so I'm not saying, I think I'm saying it does make sense, right? I think it's...
Show me the analysis. I'll change my mind if I see the numbers different, but I don't.
So I mean, this audience may appreciate it. When you look at the numbers right now, I would agree with David. You're looking at long payback periods. And even when, if I look at my systems on a payback basis, sure, we're looking at still multiple decades. But if you look at what it's done, I'm producing now, and I've looked at the numbers for one of my systems. It's an efficient house. It used about 3,700 kilowatt hours per year, which is about half of the national average, because I'd gone and I'd maxed out energy efficiency measures. It brought down the amount of electricity that I bought off the grid to just over 2,000 kilowatt hours, based on microgeneration production of 4,000 kilowatt hours. So my house was massively a net power station, providing electrons to my neighborhood. And it reduced my own electricity consumption by about 43%. The system cost, you want the numbers, about 12,000. With the subsidies at the time, my net costs were 8,000. Still looking at a payback, depending on what your assumptions of electricity rates are going to be, of let's say 20 to 25 years.
But you've got to count the subsidy. Like, that's how we do the analysis. The subsidy is public money. That's money that could have gone to some other place in our society. And if it's our job, my job as I see it, is to help advise governments and other public and elected officials how to cost effectively deal with the climate problem. And we are talking about spending many percent of total GDP if we do it efficiently. If we do it as inefficiently as you're saying, you're talking over 15% of GDP. We have real problems to solve.
Sure, but we're not actually yet getting into the job benefits, because I bet you a ton of the people in the audience today are those who are getting up on these systems and they're turning wrenches. So if you're a government, you have to look at how you're supporting, and especially in a time of transition.
Totally. Do you want to give me to tell you an energy system that would have great jobs? Go to all wood. Go back to something we had. Go to hand pulling coal out of the ground. Collectively, over the last 200 years, we've seen less and less jobs per unit kilowatt. That's a benefit. That's how society advances. You can always find ways to make jobs, but again, you've got to think across society how to spend the money in a way that is fair and cost effectively. So this jobs argument is nonsense. You've got to make it relatively. When something uses more jobs per kilowatt hour, that's because it's less efficient. That's a reason not to do it.
Sure.
So one thing I would push you on the public money, David, is if you want to talk about it in terms of what else it could be spent on, I think the right metric really is looking at the cost of public funds, right? Because in theory, there is no, you could raise, the government can raise more money. The question is what is being done with the money cost more or less than what it costs to raise that money. And I think it is, there is modeling that has been done in the US, and granted, it hasn't been done here, but I don't see any reason that it wouldn't apply, at least to some degree the same, that there are truly cost-effective, ignoring job numbers, but there are truly cost-effective distributed solar deployment that can be done, where you basically are reducing the system costs because you're, being smart about where you're putting things, and you're able to avoid upgrades in other ways, which especially in Alberta, as we see air conditioning demand really picking up, there's a real question of, can distributed solar and utility scale solar actually end up saving money because we're not building out more generation to meet that summer peak demand. And so air conditioning growth, residential has already grown from in around 2001, it was about 10% of households had air conditioners. And by 2015, it was something over 30%. It's continuing to grow. So I think, again, it's not I agree that we have to be careful about saying, just more solar is good and, as much as we can have and everywhere we can have it. I don't think that's true. But I do think that there is places where it does make economic sense. And then the policy question, which is admittedly hard, is, what's the most efficient way, given that, some solar makes sense and you have to work within the policy constructs that you have, how do you get as close to the optimal?
Yeah. I mean, within the policy contracts that we have, we're not solving this problem. So I agree that it's hard to site transmission lines, but I think that if the US and Canadian governments jointly had we plan to actually do this as national strategies to decarbonize, being honest with people about the trade-offs, I think it's almost axiomatic. It's just basic that you're going to do a bunch of this with long distance transmission. I don't know any study that doesn't do that for real. And the fact is, the Chinese are building lines that are more than twice as long as the line I said to bring solar today. Are we just saying that we don't know how to govern ourselves in North America? We're just giving up to the Chinese? This is a joke.
No, I think we're saying that because, as I've said with interties, Alberta has 3 interties into BC, into Saskatchewan, into Montana. And the amount that we use it's a piddly amount. And I just don't see with the political, and this is where I agree with you in principle, but as a guy who deals with politics and policy on a day-to-day basis, I just don't see that changing in a way that would allow for that massive transmission of power coming from Arizona up to Alberta by 2030. But I do want to move us up. We're spending a lot of time on this. I do want to move us along. Sarah, let's talk. So we've got our poll results. If I can pull them up here, just give me 1 second. Our poll results said 7% said less than 1 gigawatt, 33% said 1 to 2 gigawatts, 62% said more than 2 gigawatts. Sarah, what do you think it's going to be? Put a number to it. And talk to me, because you've talked about storage. You've also talked about overbuild, building in redundancy versus as a substitute for building more peaker plants as that 6,000 megawatts of coal comes offline by 2023 now, 7 years in advance of the phase out target. So tell me about the mix between those two.
So I tend towards the higher end, somewhere in the 1 to 2 gigawatts. I do think that the sort of economics of solar in Alberta are going to depend a lot on what happens to that summer peak, because what we've seen is, the first solar plant in Alberta is doing quite well. It's making quite a lot of money, Brook Solar, in the summertime, because it's, the first plant that's generating to meet that summer demand. And so you're going to have a little bit of a, race or trade-off as more plants come online that are generating at that time. But of course, also this, increasing trend towards the use of AC, which is really, matches up quite well with that summer demand. Blake Schaefer and Nick Rivers put out a study recently where they looked at how air conditioning demand correlates with temperature growth and sort of forecast out, really increased demand across all of Canada, but Alberta as well, in sort of this behavior where when it gets hot enough, then you buy an air conditioner, and then once you have the air conditioner, you use it. So I think that is going to be, a big piece of the future demand, and I think. That the question of storage, or there's also the potential to pair solar generation with sort of simpler forms of storage, or at least less high tech, if you want. So we think a lot about chemical storage, so batteries, lithium-ion batteries, and that's the first some of the first storage we have deployed on our grid in Alberta. Pumped hydro is another one that people talk about, but heat storage is a really important one as well. So if we're talking about things like air conditioning demand or hot water heaters, it's not that hard to shift that demand around by a few hours within a day, where you can be pre-cooling spaces so that your demand, you're using more of that power that you're generating during the day, and it goes down as the sun starts to set. You can be, if you have an electric water heater, you can be preheating the water in that water tank in a way that is, as a user, you don't experience anything differently. And that's already being done and really successfully in places in California. So I think that's also really important, that as we're doing this, we need to be looking at the ways to do so economically. And that's not always with the biggest, flashiest technology, but it does require some changes to allow the system to, people to be able to sell those kind of services into the grid. And I think as the need for them increases, as you get more solar, it's a little bit of again, these two things run in parallel. So until you can really get much benefit from balancing your demand, there's not much reason to do it. But as soon as you start to see those, high price hours that come, say, because of a fall off in solar, then there's a lot of motivation for people to try to start companies and offer services around that.
And so that's great. I think, unless I missed it, you didn't use two words that I thought you might use: duck curve. And so
I guess I hinted at it, right? And that's this idea. You
hinted at it, but specifically, so for people listening, what is the duck curve? It's a problem in California. Is it going to be a problem in Alberta? And is that going to limit the amount of solar that we're going to be able to bring on?
So I have kind of a love-hate relationship with the duck curve, because I think it's put forward as like this sort of totally unique new thing where like the power system works fine and now we have a challenge that we have to address. And I think it's better to understand the duck curve as, just yet another phenomenon that our amazing grid operators are going to manage as part of managing our system. And so, what it is obviously is that as the sun goes down, the power that's generated by solar goes down, and that can happen relatively quickly. And so you need to be able to ramp up power as the solar comes offline, and so you end up with this sort of shape that looks like the neck of a duck. But what I think you see happening is, it's not. I don't want to downplay it, but in some ways, it's not that hard to manage it. It's coming. You can think about ways to shift power over a couple of hours. You can think about energy storage over a couple of hours. Those are actually much easier problems to solve than things like seasonal storage as well, too. So I think it's important on the duck curve to say, this is something that's coming that we have to plan for, but it's not something that's impossible to manage.
Okay. The duck curve is economics working. And then I want to challenge you that people somehow don't care, or that people don't do the lowest cost thing for lots of big things in our society. The way airlines work, the way Walmart distributes stuff, there's a lot of things where we do in a brutally economically efficient way. Why are you saying that in the long run, when we try and solve the climate problem, we're just going to give up on that? we've been very efficient in lots of ways. We've done energy to date. The oil industry was very efficient in finding cheap ways to do that. You're saying as we decarbonize, we just give up? I don't buy it.
I have an answer for you on that. I think
once people get serious, they're going to want efficiency. They're going to demand it of their leaders.
I think in the interim, there is a reason for that, David. And I think it's that the people that stand to win and lose, in particular, the people that stand to lose from addressing climate are going to try to prevent action from being taken, and that will lead to less efficient things happening. So I think that's that's a big piece of it.
So if I could jump in on, and maybe this gets to your question of sort of parsing distributed generation and rooftop solar from big utility scale projects. When it comes to utility scale, the reason we've seen this flood of projects happening is because developers are making rational economic decisions. And those decisions is that we can do this on an unsubsidized basis. And we've seen it now. Alberta's finance minister, Minister Tays, has in 2 budgets running, has given a shout out to the Traverse Solar Project because it is going ahead, 465 megawatts, starting construction shortly on an unsubsidized basis. And that is tremendously important to this provincial government. Although I will say, in full disclosure, I've had some involvement in that project. It is difficult to overestimate the leap that you need to make, the creativity that's required behind the developer, but they found a way, and this will open up the floodgates for more large utility scale solar projects to come forward and compete with natural gas on the grid as the coal comes offline, developed by the right companies. So getting to this question then, rooftop solar, sure, maybe people aren't going for the lowest cost economic decision when they're putting systems up. And I've disclosed I put a couple systems up, but there's something there that is tremendously important, especially to Albertans, I think, in having a say in your own electricity production. And as the cost of power walls come down, and were the government to make allowances for time of day usage, then the rational economic argument becomes a stronger driver. And as we start to, we come in and we don't penalize residents the same we do with the transmission and distribution costs because if you look at the lion's share of your electricity bill, that's what you're paying. You're not paying your energy charges, you're paying for those costs.
I want to keep this argument going. From my perspective, given how efficient distribution and transmission is, if you decide, you're free to do it, but when you in deciding, so I'm building an all-electric house in Alberta, but I'm definitely not putting solar on the roof. Because for me, I've done the calculation, that is much less economically efficient than me just buying solar from the grid. And from my point of view, I want to use that money in some other way. I'm giving that money away to give directly that goes to some of the world's poorest, or I'm giving it away to political causes to try and drive action on climate. But from my point of view, if I bought a solar panel, that's money that isn't going to things that could more effectively decarbonize.
Yeah, but you're putting in ground source heat pumps. You're putting in geothermal. And I'll bet you, we've said this before, your numbers probably don't pencil any better than my numbers.
Well, we'll see. But I think that's something I advocate as a large scale thing Alberta could do. So I think, as I understand it, Alberta could do large scale moving to all electric homes with heat pumps. Whereas, at least as I understand it, I don't understand why you would do that with solar on rooftops. I'm not saying you should forbid people to put solar on rooftops, but it's just fundamentally the capacity factors are lower, the installation costs are higher, and the grid works. Why do it?
Yeah. Okay, we need to get to Q&A. Let's end with main barriers to development of solar in Alberta. What is the role of policy in addressing those barriers? First, I'm going to weigh in. I think it's actually in Alberta going well. And I applaud the government going to an energy-only program. I think TIER and its carbon price is successful. I think the policy is largely in place and maybe to the tune of 80%. I think the biggest factor is not a policy factor that could limit solar. It's low demand growth, and that the demand growth curves coming from industrial development are just a lot lower than they were a few years ago. But that's about the future of the economy, and we can have a whole separate conversation about that, and I'm sure we will. I've mentioned time of day incentive for residential. I think that would be a great way for the government to help. And I just think, frankly, the government of Alberta could be more welcoming to the renewables industry in general. It's amazing. We've had this Infosys announcement of 500 jobs. We have multiple ministers doing backflips. We have a tough time generating the same excitement among senior ministers in the cabinet right now, and the premier himself. And unless you have that kind of political support, you're not going to excite capital and labor the way we know they want to do around oil and gas. I think that's a very simple fix. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to talk to Alberta's elected officials and have them better understand the prospects of this industry, because either they don't get it or we're not doing a good enough job. Sarah, let's go to you.
Well, I love your last point. And I think, as much as I don't want to bring up Texas for everything else that's been going on there, I think it's a great example of a state that, is big in resource development and has really embraced solar. So I don't think there's any reason that Alberta couldn't be the same. Really high on my list of policy change for the solar industry for me is around the regulations and around the way that we compensate for things like distributed solar, the way that we enable things like demand response and storage to participate in the grid. I think that actually the procurement that was done a couple of years ago for utility scale solar in the province was really important. Because it created that competition. It caused people to kind of check out Alberta and see the opportunity to develop solar here, and the price discovery. So that the fact that the prices were published helped to kind of give some more data points. So I don't think that we necessarily need more on that side, but I would love to see really smarter ways thinking about compensating people that put solar on their roof for the actual value it's bringing to the grid. And that gets back to, I think, the discussion we were having earlier, David, where, there can be a value there, but we have to be much smarter about looking at, what is the value based on where exactly within a distribution system it is put, when it's generating as well, too, because there are choices when you're installing solar, as I'm sure many of our listeners know, about, where exactly you put it, at what angle, at what facing, and there are choices that may, depending on the sort of compensation setup that you have, that may give you more money as a homeowner, but actually be less worthwhile to the grid. And that is, a really unfortunate inefficiency that could be taken care of. Similarly, on the distribution side, with thinking about things like demand response, which I think is very important when you want to be integrating more solar. The AUC just finished its kind of review of demand response, and I'm I guess, half optimistic about what came out there. I think that the report acknowledges that this is something that the Alberta electricity system needs to consider more in the future. But it doesn't kind of go as far as actually saying, and here's how we're going to create the rules and really enable demand response to participate more fully. So I think that those things really need to be sorted. If we want to talk about what advice we should be giving to government, it's, your energy system looks different, and the old rules of the game that you have for the electricity system are going to produce some perverse responses when you apply them to these new sets of resources.
David, over to you. And now you've got your poll results. What is the percentage of electricity lost in the transmission and distribution system?
Yeah, so the poll, so whether it was the exact way we asked it, I'd say this audience did really well. 63% of you said losses were less than 10%, and so only about 37% said it was more. And, I've asked versions of this question. I've actually asked a standardized version to lots of people, undergraduate class at Harvard, energy professionals. And I find it consistently amazing that there's often a significant fraction of people, especially asked as an open question without any leading numbers, who think that grid losses are like a third or more. Actual grid losses in the whole US grid, North American grid, are basically of order 6%. So it's sort of 94% efficient. And that's both transmission and distribution. So it's close to perfect. And that's important when you think, this is obviously on a yearly average, that's important when you think about this question of the relative utility of solar on your home compared to solar somewhere else, that more or less you should think of the grid as being close to perfect. Now, that's of course not true everywhere all the time. And I agree with Sarah that there are certainly places where it might be really cost effective quite soon to do some solar on rooftops where there's local, especially local distribution system limits. And it might be that the CapEx, capital cost you have to spend to upgrade distribution, would be less than putting on the solar. If so, that makes sense, no question. And also, I should say on rooftop, I think there's a difference in residential rooftops, which tend to really have high capital costs, also high maintenance costs and poor capacity factors, compared to rooftops of big industrial kind of big box systems, which have big flat roofs. Those tend to be much more cost effective. But I think the big lesson is lots of you folks in the audience have been fighting to develop solar for decades, and I salute you. It's fantastic. Now the world is taking this seriously. We actually, if we want to protect the climate for our kids, need to decarbonize on the scale of decades. I think doing that means thinking differently about it. And I think it means doing it at an industrial scale if we really want to do it. And to argue a little bit with Ed, we've argued before, I don't think it means generally supporting renewables. I don't. I support things that make environmental sense to solve the environmental problems I know. I don't want to see more renewables all the time. I certainly don't want to see more use of wood or more use of hydro in many cases for new hydro. And I want to limit the use of wind because it has big environmental impacts. What I want to see is a massive increase in solar.
Okay. Well, let's now transition into the Q&A. We've got a first question here around jobs and domestic manufacturing. Is there a federal provincial plan which encourages manufacturing of solar cells and ancillary equipment in North America, in US and Canada? And this actually gets to something that is a major irritant to me, and that is the tariffs that we put on the imports of Chinese panels into Canada. And I'll just speak quickly. Yes, we have a domestic manufacturing industry. It's based in Ontario. You've got basically 3 players. 2 of them are very small, no offense, Helian and Silifab. One, Canadian Solar, is not selling any modules out of its Canadian facility. And essentially, it's a Chinese company that has a base in Canada. And yet the Canadian domestic government, the federal government, has decided in its wisdom that it will put tariffs, anti-dumping tariffs on the import of Chinese panels in order to prop up what is a nub of an industry and, frankly, the manufacturer of last resort. And that means when the US runs out of panels and has to go looking, then you get these construction starts, these manufacturing starts of these small players, because there are duties, there are tariffs on Canadian panels going into the US, so they pay for them at exorbitant rates, and it's a boom-bust cycle. And what it does is it creates disproportionate disbenefits for the development of solar because we have a massive cost premium to the tune of 30 to 35% because of those tariffs. There is a Canadian International Trade Tribunal hearing happening right now. This is something that we should just recognize and say, listen, the Chinese can outcompete us on the manufacturing side. This is not Canada's competitive advantage. We should cede that race, but we can get the construction jobs and actually building the systems here, but allow our developers to get the cheapest panels into the country without these silly anti-dumping tariffs. That is my rant. David, Sarah, do you have any comment? If not, happy to go on to the next question.
I'm broadly for free trade unless there are very, very clear reasons why the nation can really have a reason to believe it can build a major industry. And I certainly don't see that for solar. The only thing I can see is if there really are arguments that the Chinese companies are doing a bad job in terms of managing toxics, you could have something that said you wanted even treatment of that. But basically, I want the world to be integrated. I want free trade to happen.
As do I. Great. Okay, Sarah, we've got a question here. Why not come up with a tiered rebate system for rooftop solar? And by tiered, you get more rebate for low income, presumably low income households, no rebate for high income households.
Yeah, I think the idea behind it is right. And we know that often subsidies, whether it's solar or EVs or whatever, they tend to go to the highest income population. And so I do think we should be thinking about how our policies can be better designed to address that. Ways that I have seen that done, I think, well, one is actually to focus rather specifically on having programs to enable solar for low income communities, and especially when you're talking about things like community solar. So community members don't necessarily have to own a home, but they can participate. They can own some of that generation and really own an asset that's going to be producing for the future. I think there's also good arguments around saying as an industry kind of matures, then you should be reducing the rebates, especially on the higher income. So I think that it is a real question to look at and consider how it could be better designed. But I think really focusing on how to ensure participation from those who might be prevented due to credit scores or other reasons from participating is a good way to address that challenge.
All right. David, you've touched a nerve. There's a comment here. I'll just say as a comment, Arizona, 1,000 watts of solar produces, let's call it 1,700 kilowatt hours per year versus Calgary, 1,000 watts produces, let's call it 1,300 kilowatt hours per year. So the point is saying, I guess there's not much in it. It does not make sense to import from Arizona. I think we've beaten that one to death. Let's talk about interties, because I've stated my opinion where I think interties make complete sense, but just because of interprovincial and federal dynamics, crown corporations, fiefdoms, that it's this huge opportunity that I don't think that we'll get to. But let's speculate. How? Tell me I'm wrong. How can we get to it? Because the question here is, wouldn't better interconnections between cities and provinces make renewables and energy use more efficient?
Here's my scenario. It's the difference between so we've had decades where people talked about climate and didn't do much. Now the Canadian federal government and lots of Canadians are seriously saying they want fast action. And we've got these kind of quite amazing federal climate policy that articulates these really impressive goals of getting towards net zero and articulates high prices. That's great. But right now the costs haven't hit. And right now we're not seeing performance. So we're in the kind of period before the war, the phony war. What we're going to see, and this is my scenario for where it happens. For a few years forward, I think it's going to go just like you say, Ed. Everybody will say, well, we can't do that because we've never done it. Totally agree. Then we're going to get a point where a few years from now, we're going to find that we're not meeting our targets to decarbonize, costs are high, and we're not on track. Then we're going to have some royal commissions or whatever, and a bunch of studies. People are going to say, politicians are going to start to talk about it, and either we'll just back off from climate policy altogether, which I hope doesn't happen, or we'll have major top politicians, a level of nightly debates on TV news saying, if we want to solve this problem, we got to get serious. We cannot piss our money away. We have to do it in a cost-effective way, and one of the ways is X, Y, and Z. And at that point, if there's a will to solve the problem, it can be solved quickly. So the reality is, British Columbia has a huge amount of hydro, which could be reconfigured to do a better job for pump storage. That is literally a factor of 10 times cheaper for seasonal storage, which we must deal with if we want to decarbonize, than any realistic scenario for batteries. You're not using batteries for seasonal. And Quebec also has that. And Quebec has a huge export market. Quebec is basically sitting on a monster battery, which could help the Northeast US decarbonize. I think in the end, people make that deal because it makes money and it decarbonizes, and the public wants to see action without wrecking the budget. But I don't think that's going to happen now. And I think the next few years are going to be everybody doing everything. They're going to be saying that they're installing a silly little hydrogen-powered train out to Banff because it looks good, even though it's really cost ineffective. And then at some point, people will get serious. Yeah. Because we actually do need to decarbonize the industrial weight of the world, the rich world, and doing that, and we have to do that cost effectively or we're done.
Yeah. Once agree. I'll disagree with you on the economics of a hydrogen train out to Banff. We'll save that we've done a hydrogen episode. We'll save that for low carbon transportation. Sarah, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to just I agree with David's assessment. I think two thoughts that come to mind on it for me. One is it's going to be interesting to watch what happens in the U.S., right? Because they are really there's people there that are pretty serious. The head of the FERC Commission is talking about building transmission lines. So it'll be interesting to see how far they manage to get in the next few years. I think the other thing that's really important is that we really acknowledge where the barriers are, because we talk a lot about this kind of idea of, Alberta would suffer because we don't have a crown corporation. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. There are a few interests in Alberta that would suffer, namely the people or the companies that own peaker plants and that make their money off of times when power is scarce. And they would certainly be disadvantaged by having a bigger tie line to BC so that power could flow from the hydro batteries, if you want, during that time. But the general population of Alberta, the electricity users, those who might be developing solar or wind and others, would stand to benefit. And so I think that's also quite important that we look at, these fiefdoms and this sort of pushback on interprovincial cooperation. It's not just that we don't want to get along with our neighbors to the west, but there's really a case of winners and losers there that we need to think through. And I think that can also, help us figure out how to overcome that challenge.
Sure. Just quick follow on, Sarah. So I think you're agreeing with me is around the lack of enthusiasm within the provincial government right now for renewables. I'd sense a greater lack of enthusiasm for storage. What do you need to do? David mentioned this, we're going to miss our targets, the Royal Commission. What do you think we need to do to get provincial governments thinking more seriously about this and try to thaw the ice? Let's say that these governments are in place for a little while longer. You've got a center-left government, and you've got a right-wing government in Alberta. What do you need to do to get them to talk seriously about an intertie?
I think one thing is get the regions of Alberta that would be able to develop out their solar and wind resources excited about it and get them kind of speaking up with the government, right? And you've seen that happening again, whether it's Texas, but also many parts of the Midwest and states with Republican governors have really embraced wind and solar because local municipalities see how much revenue that can bring them. And especially now when there's so many challenges that are coming from, failed payments from oil and gas companies for leases and municipal governments are suffering as a result. To me, that's one of the most straightforward ways to get excitement for that is really how do we build excitement for harvesting this resource that we have, which can benefit quite a few people in these regions that really need that to fund their municipalities.
Great. So maybe last question on the intertie question. David, there's a question here. So you've made a passioned and rational argument for Alberta importing power from the U.S., but then people saying, how do you mitigate the security risks? And post-COVID, our supply lines sure have gotten a lot smaller. And when we had Peter Terzakian on the show many episodes ago, he talked about ESSG, environment, social, security, and governance as being the future, and particularly around energy. So how do we address the security question?
I'm not sure I understand what the security question is. The U.S. has a much bigger military than us, and it has nuclear weapons, so I don't think we're fighting a war. There are serious security questions if you're in Europe and you're talking about large-scale use of solar from North Africa, which is very politically unstable. But I do not understand what the security question is with the U.S. I think. Well,
let's be clear. It's the U.S. cutting power off to Canada. Let's say that there's the next Trump, and we get into a spat, and they say we're going to cut it off.
Fair enough. So, my view is the world is safer if it's more interconnected. My view is if everybody tries to build themselves in behind walls and limit trade, people will both be poorer and they'll be more likely to fight wars. So, I'm just not on this side. And I also just don't really buy that it's a serious risk. And partly because it goes both ways. Remember, it goes both ways up to the fact the U.S. has much more power. So if there's integration, as I said, across, part of it will be Quebec serving as the battery for New England. So in some future world like that, a Canadian prime minister would be able to have Quebec cut off their supply. The reality is, if we get into that kind of level of battle with the U.S., we're going to lose. It's 10 times bigger. They've got the money. They've got the weapons. But I just don't see a scenario that's credible like that.
Got it. Got you. If we get into that kind of battle, power is probably a lesser.
I think it's important to say other places in the world, we very much do. So this idea about, I think when you look globally and you ask how easy it is to decarbonize and what's the role for long distance grids, North America is a place where decarbonization, it turns out, is relatively easier than many other places because of some details about the scale and the economic integration. So this long distance transmission can really work here. But in Europe, where the same argument I'm just making would apply, it's much more cost effective for Germany to build a bunch of solar in North Africa. That's a really different question because North Africa is politically unstable in a way the US just isn't.
Got you. Okay, I suspect this might be our last question. We are rapidly running out of time here. Sarah, you're a dual citizen. You've worked in multiple jurisdictions. When you look around, like, what are the most advanced jurisdictions in Canada and the US? And, how are government policies making contribution to solar? And by extension, what can we learn from them and bring back here?
Yeah, so what are my favorite best in case examples? I mean, certainly Hawaii is doing a lot. The government put in place a relatively aggressive target around basically saying we're going to decarbonize a lot. Of course, they benefit from the fact that they have to import a lot of their power on ships, and so generating locally helps. California, Vermont, New York. I think what a lot of them really have in common is that clear direction from the top, right? So if somebody says this is what we're going to do, then the grid operators can figure it out. So I think that's a really big lesson for us here in Canada, is that you really just need to set that ambition, and then we can make it happen.
Okay, David, looking at your interjurisdictional perspective and experience, where do you think we should look to?
I think inevitably we should look a lot to the US. They are going to be very interconnected. I think the reality is really serious climate policy to meet these kind of decarbonize the grid by the mid 2030s goals are really quite hard. I think they're doable, but I think they're definitely going to be connected. So basically, if the US is really moving forward to do it, it's much easier for Canada to do it. And I think we want to look to connections. I mean, this business about using Alberta, using both BC and basically using Canadian hydro as part of the way that the whole North American grid decarbonizes, because again, I'm teasing you, Ed, I love you, but power walls are not remotely close to a pathway to actually decarbonizing the seasonal problem. There's not much sun in places like Alberta in the middle of the winter, and pumped hydro in the near term. There may be other things in the long term, but pumped hydro is a way that really has a pathway, and has a pathway in the next decade at the multi-gigawatt scale. And I think that's a way that integration can really happen. And frankly, the Canadians can make some money from that resource they have.
Sure. And let me say, I want the integration to happen. I want interties to happen. I think we have tremendous hydro assets. We're going to have to develop new hydro as we electrify mobility and heat in the province. We're just going to need more electricity. And what we don't need, though, I think, is site sea level environmental and cultural catastrophes. It's my personal opinion. And I want to reverse my cynicism, and I'm looking for that leadership to break down those fiefdoms so we create those interties. And ultimately, yes, we're ending on a happy, joy note, that we create those interties. And hey, if someone wants to lead the charge, I'm in. And I think you'd have the two of us in as well.
Awesome.
So, all right, I'm getting the hook. We're getting the gong show gong. Thank you so much. I'll save the usual pleasantries for another show. Over to you, Heather. We've had a great time. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.